Today I'm going to tell you about the worst defensive player of all time. He was so bad defensively, he might just be one of the worst players to ever play baseball. But he made over $22 million in his career and no one knew how bad he was while he was playing. To explain why this player was so bad, I'm going to have to show you a chart. This chart might burn your eyes. It is so grotesque that I understand if you clicked away right now. Are you ready to see it? This is a chart that shows all the defensive ratings of every player to play a total of 100 innings behind the plate since 2002. Why 2002? I would go farther if I could, but unfortunately this is the furthest Fangraphs will go. At the top you'll find no surprises. Yadier Molina, Russell Martin, Brian McCann, Buster Posey, and Jonathan LaCroix fill out the top 5. As you continue to go further and further down the chart, you'll find players like Joe Girardi and AJ Hinch, who were solid enough defenders but didn't have enough innings under the Fangraph system to be meaningful. And then you start to get to the negative valued catchers, players who were essentially warm bodies behind the plate. Isaiah Kiner-Falefa is a weird case, and it makes sense why he wasn't great behind the plate. See, he wasn't originally a catcher. He was drafted as a middle infielder, but he switched to the position in the minors so he could make it to the majors faster. It worked, but unfortunately he wasn't all that great of a defensive player. Once he made it to the majors and played a couple seasons behind the backstop, the Rangers moved him full-time to third base, where he won a Gold Glove. After winning a Gold Glove in 2020, they moved him to short, where he became the first player since Dwight D. Eisenhower was in office to play at least 50 games at shortstop and 50 games at catcher in their careers. Others on this list didn't last long behind the plate. Former super prospect Jesus Montero moved to first base, Mike Napoli became a DH, and down here at the bottom we have Carlos Santana, who is still kicking in the bigs and has primarily played first base since 2014. And oh gosh, look how bad he is. This is his dot right here, just awful. His defensive rating is 14 points worse than the second to last. The Indians gave this man 330 games behind the plate, just bleeding runs. Is it a coincidence that Cleveland didn't start doing anything in the playoffs until they moved him off the plate? Really makes your eyes bleed, doesn't it? Wait, what's this? Oh my god, this is beyond terrible. This is Ryan Doumit, the worst defensive catcher in the Fangraphs era. Perhaps the worst defensive catcher of all time, and it isn't particularly close. With a negative 148.9 DEF, Doumit's catching abilities does laps around the other catchers. He's doing the course in reverse. Quick, let's zoom back up to the best defensive catchers to save our eyes. Yadier Molina's 383.4 defensive rating looks so much better after looking at that horrid nightmare, doesn't it? Well, since we're on Molina, let's talk about it. See, Molina's played a lot of innings behind the plate. DEF is a cumulative stat, which means the more you play, the more you can accumulate. Molina's good, don't get me wrong, but he's played 4,000 more innings than the second place Martin. Still, Molina is definitely someone you want behind the plate. He's saving your team 2/100ths of a run every inning he catches. And while this doesn't seem like a lot, over the course of the season, this is 20 runs. That's really, really good. You know what's not good? Ryan Doumit's catching. Yeah, we gotta go back. Look at this. This is ugly. I can't believe 3 teams let him catch for as long as they did, but it happened. Domit's negative 148.9 DEF isn't even the inverse of Molina's abilities. He was so much worse. Let's look at those innings again. It's shocking that Doumit got almost 4,400 innings behind the plate in the major leagues. Santana only got 2,800 before Cleveland realized they needed to move him off the plate. But Doumit isn't even near Molina's 17,666 innings. On an inning basis, Doumit was actually a full 100th of a run worse defensively than Molina's inverse, which means instead of gaining the team an extra 2/100ths of a run every time he was catching, Doumit was costing his team 3/100ths of a run every inning. I know, this doesn't sound like a lot, we're working with the hundredths place after all, but if you were to simply expand this out to a full game, you'd find that Doumit cost his team 1/3 of a run every game he was behind the plate. Yadier Molina, the best defensive catcher in our era, only gains his team 1/5 of a run a game. So what made Doumit's catching so bad? The simple answer is everything but one thing specifically. If that's all you wanted to know, I suppose you have your answer. But we haven't even gotten to the part where I explain how he was 100% deserving of his career earnings. But if you wanted a more in-depth answer, let me break it down for you. Unlike defensive superstars, there aren't really highlight reels for horribly bad defensive players, especially catchers. Catchers just kind of stand there. They don't have to take hilariously bad routes or cut off the outfielder as an outfielder. They can make horrible throws, however. One of the few videos left of Doumit catching on the internet is this grainy footage of him hitting John Grabo. John Grabo was the pitcher. He hit his own pitcher trying to catch a runner stealing. It's hilarious, it's awful, but sometimes mistakes happen. Just last season, Austin Hedges hit Jarren Duran on a throw back to the pitcher, and Hedges is known for his defense. Throwing isn't exactly what makes a catcher bad. Doumit was never particularly great at throwing out base stealers, but he usually wasn't horrific. Sure, he never had a season where he was positive in the stat called RSB, which is a metric Fangraphs uses to measure a catcher's ability to catch runners attempting to take extra bases, but he did have a few zeros in there. In his worst season in 2010, he cost the Pirates 8 runs alone on stolen bases. This was 2 runs worse than the second worst catcher, Jorge Posada, who had -6. Posada apparently was not a good defensive catcher in the later stages of his career. If this surprises you, it surprised me too. Of course, stolen bases alone didn't doom Doumit. Another stat you can look at for Doumit is RGFP. This stat tells you how good a catcher is at blocking the plate and preventing wild pitches and pass balls. Again, Doumit wasn't great, but throughout the course of his career, he was only slightly negative. What I've shown you so far is a bad defensive catcher. It does not show you the worst defensive catcher, by far. You might still be wondering how these stats alone make Doumit the worst catcher of all time, and maybe even the worst player of all time. I'm gonna get to it right now. Let's talk about framing runs, or FRM. This is a stat that measures how good a catcher is at stealing strikes or losing strikes. And if you're skeptical about framing, I understand. When Fangraphs adjusted WAR a few years ago to include framing, it adjusted players' WAR by plus or minus 15 WAR. Martin, McCann, and 2 of the Molina brothers got huge boosts. 15 WAR over the course of the season can make or break a Hall of Famer. This is huge. While I personally might not agree to the extent of the WAR adjustment, the argument is pretty clear. The catcher is behind every play of the game. The difference between a 1-0 count and a 0-1 count is huge. If you were to just look at this difference, a batter would have a 20-point advantage in the batting average and a full 100 points in slugging if they simply had 1 ball instead of 1 strike. But it gets even bigger. Let's look at the difference between a 3-1 count and a 2-2 count. Hitters hit nearly 200 points better when the count was 3-1 than they did 2-2. So, if you can't steal strikes for your team, or if you're constantly bleeding strikes, you will hurt your team defensively. Fangraphs writers were a little skeptical when these calculations came out too, and here's why. Ryan Doumit was hit with a whopping -60 framing runs in 2008, essentially meaning that his catching alone cost his team 60 full runs in framing. Now this might sound absurd, but when they looked into it, they found that when Doumit was behind the plate, pitchers allowed 0.44 more runs per 9 innings than with any other catcher behind the plate. And so when framing adjusted WAR came out in 2019, Doumit lost 16 WAR, 5 more than any other catcher. He went from having a decent career at 5.7 WAR to a -10.4, which is the second worst player of all time. It was later adjusted to 8.6, but still, this only bumped him up 1 spot. If you were to look at Fangraphs today, he is listed as the 3rd worst player to ever play Major League Baseball. And unfortunately, I can't really show you how bad Doumit was behind the plate. There aren't really a whole lot of videos left of Doumit catching regularly. There's this where Doumit is behind the plate, and even though it's hidden to play, you can definitely tell his receiving abilities were pretty rough. I can, however, show you bad framing. The worst receiver in 2021 was Salvador Perez.
Ooh.
Perez cost his team -19.6 framing runs over the course of 1,002 innings. This is terrible. It's also a mark Doumit hit just 3 times in his career. Once when he only played 18 innings for the Braves, and the other 2 where he played under 462 innings, more than half the innings Perez played in 2021. So at this point, you might be wondering how Doumit stayed in the league for so long, especially as a catcher. And the answer is that he was a pretty good hitter, especially for a catcher. Sure, he had seasons where he was below average, like 2009, but the catcher position isn't exactly known for hitting. Additionally, his second worst defensive season happened to be his second best offensively. He hit .318 with a .501 slugging, which was good for a 123 WRC+. This is really good. The second and more obvious reason is that framing wasn't available when Doumit was playing. I'm sure Pirates coaches knew that Doumit wasn't a great defensive catcher, but they definitely didn't know to the extent of how bad Doumit was. Sure, he struggled to throw runners out, but he wasn't typically the worst, and he managed to block pitches with just slightly worse than average abilities. If you were just looking at his defensive abilities by these metrics, you can understand why he was moved off the position eventually, but you can also see why he stuck around the plate so long. So was Doumit the 3rd worst player to ever play baseball? I think it's definitely an unfair assessment. During his playing career, he was seen as an above average hitter who played a little below average defense. That's 100% deserving of $22 million over the course of his 10-season MLB career. But he was definitely one of the worst to play behind the plate, and he definitely could have benefited from just playing the outfield.